World War II directly leads to what's known as the Cold War. It's called the Cold War because there's no real direct fighting between the two major superpowers coming out of World War II, the Soviet Union and the United States. World War II was fought to stop Nazi aggression and to preserve democracy in Europe. However, we know that the capitalist democracy of the United States and Britain, and then eventually France after it's liberated, really has a conflict with the communist totalitarian dictatorship of the USSR, the Soviet Union. These conflicting ideologies were put away during the wartime because of the necessity to work together to defeat the fascists in Germany. However, the end of World War II laid the foundations for the beginning of the Cold War. As the Soviet Union swept through Eastern Germany, its military stayed right where it was. And one of the things that was in Eastern Germany was the capital of Germany at Berlin. The western half of Germany was occupied by a coalition of Britain, France, and the United States, and they stay where they are. And that boundary between East and West Germany really doesn't change for the 60 years during which the Cold War is being fought. The Soviet Union wanted to have what it called satellite states, or a buffer zone between the West and Russia proper. If you go all the way back to the time of Napoleon, the Soviet Union, Russia had been invaded by European countries through those Eastern Bloc countries. So the Soviet Union doesn't want to give up its control of the eastern half of Europe. The United States and the other democratic governments wanted to see free and fair elections being held throughout Europe. The assumption was that the free and fair elections would allow democratic capitalist countries that would support the United States side to be brought into control. So we have this conflict between the two sides that really lasts for the next 60 years or so, and we'll see that in the tensions that brew up throughout the 50s, 60s, all the way up into the 90s. In the post-World War II era, the immediate couple of years right after World War II ends, the United States continued to support its allies, and to a certain extent it was already competing against the Soviet Union, especially when it came to the Soviet Union controlling those Eastern Bloc countries. As we supported our other wartime allies, the British and the French, there was a number of uncomfortable situations that emerged. The British and the French both had colonial control in territories outside of Europe still. We already talked about how Britain gave up some of its territory in Palestine to help create Israel. They also had control over places like Greece. The British were trying to prop up an autocratic government in Greece, which was friendly to the British, and they were trying to prop up this autocratic, meaning dictatorship, in Greece so that it wouldn't fall into communist-leaning rebel hands. Again, the fear of communism was a bigger fear than the fear of a dictatorship. So the United States helped take that up. We sent money to the British and weapons to the British to help them prop up that autocratic Greek government. The French had territories in Southeast Asia, most notably in Vietnam. And the United States did try to help prop up forces in Vietnam and other southern Eastern Asian territories held by the French when those nationalist forces tried to overthrow the French. It's one of the reasons that the United States eventually gets involved in the Vietnam territory is because the French failed to fight off the communist forces there. So the United States, because of this support of our allies around the world, became involved in containing communist threats worldwide in this post-war community. World War II ended in 1945. By 1946, the tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States were so palpable that the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill started talking about what he called an iron curtain descending over Eastern Europe. This means that in his view, the Soviet Union had become such a threat and dominated so much of Eastern Europe that communism was entrenched there. There was a fear of communism expanding, especially into the war-torn regions of Western Europe. One of the key elements of communism is this idea that it will expand and eventually take over the world. So there was a threat to this. President of the United States at the time, Harry Truman, developed what's known as the Truman Doctrine, which was a pledge to contain communism in Europe. And it was applied when the British asked for help against Greece, and also when we assisted Turkey in an effort to resist communism from spreading into those areas. Again, because we were afraid that the war-torn regions in Europe would fall to communism, because communism made this promise to the working class and the middle and lower classes that they would help prop up the society, the United States wanted to offer financial assistance to these areas to get the economy going, build up industry, raise the standard of living, which would keep those populations from turning to communism as a desperation move. The Truman Doctrine is going to be associated with what's known as the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was the way the Truman Doctrine worked because it gave money to these war-torn regions in an effort to promote economic rebuilding, prevent the fall of European countries' communism, which would stop and contain communism from spreading. It's fairly effective, and within a decade or so, two of our biggest Marshall Plan recipients, Western Germany, which was controlled by the United States and its allies, and Japan, become two of the most economically powerful countries in the world. So the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, very important for containment. Nobody really wanted to fight another war. First of all, the war-torn regions were sick of fighting. The Soviet Union had lost 20+ million people. They didn't want to fight. The United States was seeing that it was an economic superpower coming out of this time. They didn't want to fight. But there is that tension between the Soviet Union and the United States. And the Soviet Union was irritated by the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan. Not wanting to fight, the Soviet Union was looking for a way to irritate the West. The map of Europe was very uncomfortable after the war. Remember, we said that the armies didn't move after they had gone into Germany. So we have East Germany, which was controlled by the Soviet Union, and West Germany controlled by the joint forces of the British, French, and the United States. The uncomfortable situation was that the capital of Germany, Berlin, was well within the Eastern Soviet-controlled side of Germany. And what really made it uncomfortable was that the Allies agreed to separate Berlin as well. So half of Berlin was controlled by the Soviet Union, and the other half was controlled by the United States, Britain, and France. So you had this little section of capitalist democracy within this vast expanse of communist-controlled East Germany. In order to irritate the West, Stalin and the Soviet Union decided to blockade Berlin. They refused access to Berlin from the Western Allies. They lined up their tanks at the border and wouldn't let the supply trucks through. What Stalin was doing was testing the waters. He wanted to see if the Americans would attack, and if he did, he had the right to attack them back. But really, what he was trying to do was get Berlin onto his side. He wanted to control all of Berlin, and that way it'd be like a thumb in the eye to the Western Allies. The United States won this tension, though, and it becomes the first conflict in which the United States does win in the Cold War. They used their military technological superiority, and they actually used airplanes in what's called the Berlin Airlift in 1948 and 1949, and they flew over the blockade and dropped supplies into West Berlin. Later, because of this irritation, and because Stalin has to go through, has to pull back, this does lead to a bigger arms race. Stalin beefs up his conventional forces. But also, later on, in 1962, Berlin is going to be chained off with a fence. And eventually that fence becomes bigger and more powerful. And the symbolism of the Berlin Wall becomes incredibly important. And while that wall remains, the Cold War is on. And once that wall falls in the early 1990s, 1992, that is symbolic of the Cold War ending. The Cold War is characterized, and really the overall tensions are enhanced by by the nuclear arms race. In 1949, the United States had what's referred to as a nuclear monopoly. The United States had the only nuclear weapons that we had known about. The United States immediately after the war began to form what's called NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was a series of military alliances, mostly of the Western European countries, aimed to contain communism. In 1949, when the Soviet Union tested its own atomic bomb, the nuclear monopoly of the United States ended, and it accelerated the biggering of nuclear weapons. We started to develop hydrogen bombs, which are exponentially larger than the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And by this I mean they used to measure the atomic bomb in kilotons, which are thousands of tons worth of dynamite. The bomb dropped on Hiroshima was, I think, 15 kilotons, so 15,000 tons worth of dynamite. The largest hydrogen bomb created was by the Soviet Union. It was designed as a 100 megaton bomb, which would be 100 million tons of TNT. By the time we get to the 1980s, there are enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world 10 times over. The Soviet Union forms a Warsaw Pact in response to NATO in 1955. And what happens is NATO and the Warsaw Pact become nuclear umbrellas. So if any member of NATO were to be attacked by a Soviet weapon, then the United States would send its full complement of nuclear weapons against the Soviet Union, which would then, the Soviet Union would send their complement of weapons at the United States, and we'd have essentially nuclear annihilation. This is called mutually assured destruction, and the hope was that by having so many weapons, they would never be used. An interesting thing happened during the Cold War. The Cold War was a global issue, a global fight between the capitalist United States and the communist Soviet Union. So what ends up happening is these two countries, these two superpowers, are going to fight over the friendship of what we'd call third world countries. The Soviet Union is the second world, the United States is the first world, so the third world is all these other countries that we want to get to side with us. The Asian territories, specifically China, in the early 40s, during World War II and just after, was going through a civil war. The United States was supporting the democratic, capitalist, nationalist Chiang Kai-shek. He was fighting against the communist leader, the rebels, led by Mao Zedong. In 1949, the communists, led by Mao, are going to defeat the nationalists in China. Chiang Kai-shek is forced to flee. He and his nationalists leave and go to the island of Taiwan, which until the late 60s, early 70s is not called Taiwan. It's actually recognized as official China. And communist China, is the entire mainland part, is not recognized by the United States as an official territory. The United States assumed that they were close allies with the Soviet Union, but later in the Nixon presidency, the 70s, we realized that the communists in China didn't really like the communists in the Soviet Union. So there is a Cold War element in Asia as well. The fact that the Chinese territory was under the control of communists is important, but not for the reasons that we probably think. They have a huge communist army that they can pull from. But the real tension was not with the Chinese, but in other areas within Asia. We'll famously talk about Vietnam later in Standard 8. And right after World War II, we actually get more involved in the Korean Peninsula. If you remember, we had asked the Soviet Union to help us invade Japan at the end of World War II if necessary. They had taken over the northern part of the Korean Peninsula, and when we dropped the atomic weapons on Japan and Japan surrendered, the Soviet Union left, but they left behind communism. And what happens in the 1950s is that those communists in North Korea invaded South Korea. We believe that it was orchestrated by the Soviet Union. So the Truman administration actually urged the United Nations to go in and to eliminate the communist threat from North Korea. The United Nations voted unanimously to defend South Korea and ordered a ceasefire. Then the United Nations allowed the United States to lead what we'd call a police action, to go into South Korea to try to push the North Koreans back to the pre-war border. We had a majority of troops, and the financial support came from the United States. We did push those invading forces all the way back to the North Korean border, and then we thought we could try to push them out of the peninsula entirely. So we pushed the North Koreans all the way up almost to the Chinese border, but remember, now the Chinese are communists as well. They want a buffer between themselves and the South Korean U.S. sympathizers. So the Chinese start pushing back at this point and aiding support to the North Koreans. It becomes a pretty big mess, and Dwight Eisenhower actually is going to be elected in 1952, promising to get us out of the Korean War. Eventually what happens, the border settles right back at that 38th parallel, which is what it was pre-war. We lost several thousand troops. We spent millions of dollars fighting this war, and yet we saw it as a victory even though the border stayed exactly where it was. The reason for this is because we were fighting under the idea of containment. We simply wanted to contain communism where it was. We weren't trying to eliminate it entirely. We just didn't want it to spread into previously non-communist territories. Most school children learn about the space race pretty early on, and it's usually couched in the terms of John F. Kennedy promising to send a man to the moon. If we look at the space race from the context of the Cold War, though, it's much more sinister than just who can get to the moon first. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched the first man-made satellite into space. It's called Sputnik, S-P-U-T-N-I-K, Sputnik in 1957. This is a terrifying development for the United States. If the Soviet Union can launch a missile into space that contains a man-made satellite that can orbit the Earth, the problem then becomes for the United States, they can also attach not just a satellite, but they can put a nuclear weapon on top of that missile and launch it from anywhere in the world and hit any other spot on the planet. The space race is really a nuclear arms race to a certain extent. And when the Soviet Union sends Sputnik up into space, the United States becomes really scared because now the Soviet Union can attack us from anywhere. But we're also nervous because the United States sees itself as getting fat and lazy, that our capitalist system has provided so much material wealth that our school children were busy playing games and not trying to help win this Cold War. So the United States Congress actually passed the National Defense Education Act to promote math and science skills. We were also trying to counteract this idea that consumerism was making us lazy. We wanted to win this war, which is why when John F. Kennedy comes out in 1960 and says, "We will be the first to the moon," it's not a statement about how great we are. It's a statement to say we can become technically superior to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union sent the first man-made object into space with Sputnik. They sent the first living creatures into space. I forget the dog's name, Laka, I believe. They sent a dog into space. They had the first astronaut, they called them cosmonauts, Yuri Gagarin, into space. Now, the United States was always right behind, but Kennedy's message was important because we needed to get to the moon first to prove that we could become technically superior. Again, the idea of the space race was this fear of nuclear weapons, which were much bigger, much more powerful at this point. And now you could attack using what's called intercontinental ballistic missiles. They can attack anywhere in the world. Some people started building bomb shelters as a result of this, much more prevalent in the Soviet Union than the United States. But the space race leads to this whole new nuclear fear. All of the events following World War II, leading up to the 1950s, really set the stage for a second Red Scare. Remember, the first was in the 1920s. We talked about the Red Scare. But in the 1940s and 50s, we see this again. During the late 1940s, the Truman administration began talking about the Soviet Union in terms of good versus evil. The Soviet Union was an evil in the world, and the United States had to counterbalance that evil with all of our goodness. We had a lot of anxiety in the country because of things like the fall of China to the communist Mao. The Soviet Union developed an atomic weapon in the late 1940s and hydrogen weapons by the mid-1950s. These bombs were exponentially larger than anything they dropped on Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Propaganda throughout the United States existed for the Cold War. Very anti-Soviet in its media, very pro-American in the media culture. So there is this climate of fear that develops. There's this anti-Soviet climate of fear that emerges, and a lot of this is going to lead to future partisan issues that we're going to call McCarthyism. But it's also this fear of being soft on communism. The Republicans hadn't been in office since 1933 when Roosevelt, the Democrat, took over. It's now post-war 1940s, and the Republicans were looking for any sort of issues that would help get them back into power. The issue that came to the front most quickly was this fear of communism, and they really took partisan advantage of this. One of the people that was most used this tactic the best was Senator Joe McCarthy from West Virginia. He went on this incredibly long anti-communist crusade, and there wasn't really a whole lot of truth in what he did. He was a practitioner of what's called the big lie. This is where you repeat an untrue accusation, in this case with affiliation on communism, really loudly and really often. And if you say something loudly and often enough, then people start to begin to believe it's true. He accused many people within the Truman administration of having ties to communism. In fact, even implying that Truman himself was soft on communism, that he wouldn't fight it hard enough because he didn't really disagree with some of the principles. A number of diplomats, artists, statesmen are going to be called in front of what's called HUAC, the House on Un-American Activities Commission, including the future President Ronald Reagan, who was asked to help root out communists within Hollywood. A number of people even within the Hollywood acting sphere are going to be blacklisted or blackballed. They're going to be kept out of acting jobs because they're accused of being communists. Eventually what happens is the president at the time, Dwight Eisenhower, in 1952 gets elected. He's a Republican. He does not want to get directly involved with McCarthy, but McCarthy makes a mistake and attacks the military. McCarthy starts accusing members of the military of being communist or having communist sympathies, and Eisenhower, the general of Normandy, the five-star general, can't have his army being dishonored like this. So rather than attack McCarthy directly, what he does is have these Army McCarthy televised hearings. McCarthy was essentially a drunk. He didn't look good on TV. He was nervous during these hearings. And what ends up happening is he looks like a bully on TV, accusing these young soldiers of being un-American. And when the public saw him on TV, they rejected him. They didn't believe that this is who they had been supporting for the last few years. Now later it's revealed that there were some spies working within the U.S. government, but it was never as many as what McCarthy had suggested, nowhere near the amount that he had suggested. And the public servants that had lost their reputations, that were unjustly smeared without due process, really suffered through this McCarthy era. This becomes associated with the idea of witch hunts, or looking for things that aren't there, or not nearly in the way that people think they are. Of all places, Cuba became a hot point in the Cold War. Cuba is only about 60 miles off the southern coast of Florida, and for the last 60 years, going all the way back to 1898 in the Spanish-American War, Cuba had really been controlled, at least in practice, by the United States. And we had put in American-backed dictators. In the late 1940s, a group of rebels led by Fidel Castro sought to nationalize different American-owned properties in the area and essentially overthrow the dictators that had close relations with the United States. Castro, after the rebellion, decides to join up with the Soviet Union as a way to protect themselves against the United States, so they decided to become communist. In response to this, Eisenhower allowed a program to be developed that would take Cuban exiles, people that had been sent away from Cuba, train them by the CIA, and then let them invade Cuba with the hopes that they would lead a rebellion to overthrow Castro. By the time this occurs, Kennedy is in office in 1960, and it fails miserably. It's called the Bay of Pigs invasion, and it fails, and Kennedy it looks like Kennedy made a bad decision, although it does look like he's trying to fight communism in our hemisphere. So he comes off looking as like a Cold War warrior. This helps him later in Berlin, Vietnam, and other areas. In 1963, the United States sent spy planes over Cuba, and the spy planes photographed nuclear missile sites being built in Cuba. The Soviet Union was going to send nuclear missiles called intermediate-range ballistic missiles, which would be able to hit almost anywhere in the United States, and place them in the island of Cuba. The United States can't have nuclear missiles in Cuba, at least in their perspective. So the United States sets up a blockade around the island of Cuba, not wanting to let anything in or out, especially Soviet ships. This is a moment of intense tension in the world. This is literally the moment where we came closest to nuclear annihilation. If the United States attacked the Soviet Union in this blockade, or if the Soviet Union tried to run the blockade, it in all likelihood would have escalated into nuclear war, where both sides just shoot off all of their nuclear missiles. We had a tense 13 days, almost 2 weeks, where nobody knew what was happening. Finally, this tension ends with an agreement between the Soviet Union, led by Khrushchev at the time, not even going to try to spell it, do your best, and John F. Kennedy. Essentially what happens is the missiles are taken away from Cuba, and the United States agreed to take some missiles away from Turkey, which is about the same distance away from the Soviet Union. So it's the closest we ever came to an armed conflict with the Soviet Union. And what's really interesting is in the aftermath of this, we realized how close we came to nuclear annihilation. We set up a hotline between the Soviet Union and the United States, the leaders, so the premier in the Kremlin and the United States president had a phone that they could pick up and just call and talk directly. And they were really trying to put that nuclear genie back in the bottle. The Cold War is characterized by competition between the Soviet Union and the United States. They did not want to fight directly, which is why it's called a Cold War. The fear of nuclear weapons, mutually assured destruction, and just the cost of fighting was far too great. So we can see that the Soviet Union and the United States competed in what's often called third world countries. And one area in particular that they were concerned with was the Middle East. There are a number of reasons for this. First of all, the United States was a very strong supporter of the State of Israel, going all the way back to 1948, when the United States became the first country to recognize the State of Israel. Also, we're very concerned with oil. The United States was built on this this foundation of cheap oil, which meant cheap energy, which meant we could industrialize, and we had highway systems that were fueled by cars that didn't have very great gas mileage, and we needed that cheap oil to have cheap gas, which fueled our highway system, which led to and helped develop the suburban culture that we hold dear. One of the reasons that we supported Israel so strongly was, remember, the guilt that we felt over not doing much for the Holocaust. So the United States is going to be a very strong supporter of Israel throughout this time, even in the face of difficulty as the Arab countries start to unite around a effort to get rid of Israel. This does impact our future issues with wanting that that cheap oil supply. The conflicts in the Middle East over oil supply and the State of Israel really can best be seen with the Suez Canal crisis of 1956. This is an interesting story. The Soviet Union had become more involved in the Middle East. Remember, the United States and the Soviet Union are competing over getting the interest of these third world countries. One country in particular that was really important was Egypt. Egypt was sort of playing the game the right way for them. They were interested in getting the best possible deal for themselves. So the United States and the Soviet Union were both offering Egypt different things. Egypt was important because of something called the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal was a waterway in between the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea. If that canal wasn't there, then oil from the Mideast would have to go all the way around the southern tip of Africa to get to Europe. This cut the time and cost of oil dramatically for Europe. When the Egyptians started to talk to the Soviet Union about getting aid, the fear was that Egypt would turn to communism and that Suez Canal would be cut off to the Western world. So what ends up happening, Britain and France combine with Egypt. They ally with Israel, and Israel, it's convoluted. Israel pretends to attack Egypt. British and the French step in to what they say defend the Suez Canal. Turns out they were working together all along in order to take over the Suez Canal from Egypt. When Eisenhower got news of this, he was very upset because by taking the Suez Canal without American permission, this could have caused many different problems. Britain and France and Israel were all part of NATO, that North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And if Egypt had been allied with the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union had attacked Britain and France, that would have drawn the United States into a war, and it very easily could have led to nuclear war. Eisenhower, for his part, disavowed everything that the British and the French did, forced them to apologize to Egypt, and what ends up happening is what's called the Eisenhower Doctrine. Eisenhower said that the United States would step in and offer any aid and assistance to any Middle Eastern country fighting communism as needed. So it's essentially an extension of the Truman Doctrine as applied to the Middle East. It didn't take long for Middle Eastern countries to realize that the potential power that they had with their oil production. Early on, they realized that the United States was fueled by this cheap oil. And in the 1970s, all of these oil-producing countries formed OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. And in the 1970s, because OPEC was frustrated with Israel and the treatment of the United States, the support of the United States by Israel, and a couple of different wars, the Yom Kippur War, the Six-Day War, which Israel had won largely because of American support, OPEC embargoed the United States. So a lot of our Middle Eastern policy, starting in the 1970s, had to do with trying to free up this oil so that we could keep that cheap energy. The United States, led in the 1970s by Jimmy Carter after 1976, did try some humanitarian efforts as well. Carter led what's called the Camp David Accords. Israel had taken over a large amount of territory in Egypt, notably the Sinai Peninsula, which is the little peninsula next to Egypt, and the Egyptians wanted that back. Israel wanted to be recognized as a country within the Arabic world, and Jimmy Carter negotiated a peace between Israel and Egypt. The Egyptian leader, Nasser, and the Israeli Prime Minister did agree to this pact. It was done at Camp David, which is the presidential retreat here in the United States. This does help situations a bit. But just to show you how difficult things were, the Egyptian president was actually assassinated because of this Camp David Accord, and we still have tensions in the Middle East over this issue with Israel even today. The United States was constantly trying to continue that supply of cheap oil. One example is that in the 1950s, the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, did overthrow the Shah, the legitimate power in Iran, and established the Shah. And the Shah then took over the oil interests and became one of our close friends. In the 1970s, this hurts the United States because a fundamentalist Islamic group then overthrows the Shah, which becomes a very big problem for the United States. The Shah is forced to flee. Carter, being a humanitarian, allows the Shah to come to the United States, which upsets the radical Islamic State in Iran. Iran then takes the American embassy and holds 150 hostages, holds 150 Americans hostage, and doesn't let them go for 444 days. Carter tried to rescue them, which failed miserably. And when Reagan is elected in 1980, that's when the hostages are finally released. These relationships with Iran are continued continue to be strained even today. One area of particular strain in the Middle East, not for the United States, but for the Soviet Union, was Afghanistan. Afghanistan was an important buffer for the Soviet Union between the United States allies further south and the Soviet Union proper. Also, Afghanistan had a number of natural resources that the Soviet Union wanted, and it was just a general Middle Eastern third world country that we wanted to have friendly relationships with. The Soviet Union did. It becomes a Soviet Union version of the American Vietnam. It's a quagmire that the Soviet Union couldn't get out of. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, tried to put friendly government in Afghanistan, and it just failed miserably. One important note for us is that the Soviet Union, one important note for us is that the United States decided to send supplies to Afghanistan to fight the Soviet Union. Again, this is how many of the conflicts in the Cold War occurred. We didn't fight directly with the Soviet Union, but we had our friends fight for us. And we gave weapons to our friends so that they would fight. Basically, this is the argument against the United States and Vietnam, which we'll talk about later as well, is that the Vietnamese in the north, who were communists, were getting supplied by China or the Soviet Union. But we'll talk about that more later. Eventually what happens is that the Soviet Union leaves Afghanistan, and what's left behind is a bit of a vacuum, and out of that vacuum emerges the Taliban. The Taliban is the organization which we went to war with after September 11th in 2001. The entire indicator has been a discussion of the conflicts between the Americans and the Soviet Union and how we fought through our proxies, our friends and allies. We didn't want to directly confront each other. The end of the Cold War is much debated, and we still argue about it today, and we'll talk about it more at the end of Standard 8. But essentially what happens is that there were changes in the Soviet Union, known as Glasnost and Perestroika. The leadership led by Mikhail Gorbachev was trying to open up some of the Soviet Union. There were issues with the economy. A lot of it was the strain caused by the Afghani war in the Soviet Union. Part of it is the arms race that was escalated by the president in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan. There is a liberation movement that occurs in Eastern Europe led by Lech Walesa in Poland. And so there's a number of factors that go into the ending of the Cold War. But really it is the crumbling of the Soviet Union that leads to the end of the Cold War. And the symbol of the Cold War had always been the Berlin Wall, created in the early 1960s by Khrushchev. And in 1989, the Berlin Wall falls. Now, it's important as a physical wall falling, but it's more important as a symbolic victory of the United States over the Soviet Union. When the Berlin Wall falls, the end of the Cold War is signaled, and in 1990, 1991, the Soviet Union disintegrates, and Gorbachev and the Communist Party and the Soviet Union are done, and we have a new cluster of countries, of independent countries, the largest of which was independent Russia, led by Boris Yeltsin, but also a number of Eastern European countries that emerge, which are still a bit in flux.